here to talk about advocating for water quality in Southeast Michigan. And Robert and I go back a ways. I know Robert from working in the Areas of Concern program out here in Michigan. We have 14 areas of concern. They're also known as the toxic hotspots of the Great Lakes region, where we've had mainly legacy contamination, some of which has been the result of industrial practices over time. But Robert also serves on the board of directors for the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council. He's been there since about 2000 and has concentrated on the remediation of allied paper, Portage Creek, the Kalamazoo River area of concern. He represents the council of, on the Michigan Statewide Public Advisory Council. Again, that's kind of where I'm familiar with Robert's advocacy work for the Kalamazoo River, and also as a statewide representative on those issues related to the areas of concern. He also represents the council on the Southeast Michigan Water Resources Council, which is reviewing water use in the Kalamazoo River and St. Joseph watersheds, looking at primarily groundwater withdrawal issues. He represents the Watershed Council and Watershed Council interests generally on the statewide Water Use Advisory Council, which is reviewing Michigan's water use and sustainability. And he also participates in the stakeholder panel under the EPA, which is providing public information on the Marshall oil spill cleanup, one of the largest oil spills that we've had in the United States, right here in our backyard. So subsequent to graduating from Harvard College in economics, he's served 5.5 years with the U.S. Naval Reserve, working on nuclear weapons, and an intelligence analyst in the Pacific. And after his naval service, he completed an MBA at Golden Gate University in San Francisco, and that led to employment with Cowley Maritime Corporation, where he worked in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and Dubai and other locations. And prior to retirement in 2009, he's worked in the paper and pulp industry operations as a consultant in North America and Asia. So it's a real treat and pleasure to introduce Robert Whitesides to talk to you about water quality in Southeast Michigan.
Thank you. Water everywhere. When Coleridge wrote that, he seemed to have been under the influence of psychotropic substances, people think, but we are blessed. That's me. I'm representative. The council president, Dr. Stephen Hamilton, he's at MSU at the Kellogg Biological Station. Probably one of the most knowledgeable people about Michigan waters and rivers and hydrogeochemistry. He spends his sabbaticals in Australia primarily, and also has a large number of contacts through Latin America, where he served. He did some of his graduate studies, very well connected, probably one of the brightest people about water in Michigan. Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River Basin. I wanted to put this all in perspective. What are we looking at when we look at Great Lakes, and how big is it? I'm not going to stand up because I've got some disc issues in my back. Michigan is the only state in the Great Lakes Basin that is entirely surrounded by the Great Lakes. So we have interests that other states don't. Oops. You can see Indiana's interest in the basin is not huge. Same with Ohio. Minnesota a bit more, but Wisconsin. Illinois has a very strange situation. They are under a Supreme Court jurisdiction that, because of the withdrawal through the Chicago River, they have a maximum that they can take out of the lakes every year, and that's declining. That's a result of an aquifer in Wisconsin going bad that they shared with Illinois, and they claimed that Illinois was over-extracting, so the Supreme Court forced them to switch to lake water rather than tapping the aquifer. And also they're flushing, of course, most of the city sewers of Chicago into the Mississippi, which has backwards resulted in the carp problem coming up the Mississippi. So it all gets back to too many connections, yeah.
At one time, the Chicago River ran the other way,
Oh, yeah.
and they would have been flushing all that into Lake Michigan if it wasn't going down the Mississippi River.
Right,
That's
and that
right.
was before anybody decided they'd treat it and make it so you could actually drink it or use it. And that's why the intakes near Chicago, if you're in the city and you look way out, quite a ways out in the lake, you'll see the freshwater intakes for the drinking water. Let's see, we're off-sited. I put this in because too many times we see, I'll get this sooner or later. We see mentions like number of jobs tied to the Great Lakes. I don't know what ties them there. I don't know what kind of rope they have. You know, people make these claims, but this substantiation would probably be a little bit hard to do. You will read these, take them with a grain of salt. It's like when the pipeline company claims they're gonna create several thousand jobs. For how long and what kind of jobs, and are they local jobs? So when you see these, even though you may side with this, you may believe, you want to believe this, you know, be a little bit skeptical, if not cynical. Threats to water, current threats, oil, chemical spills, and legacy pollution. These are the big ones that I see right now. We know about the Line 6B in Marshall. Has anybody not seen this picture? It would be hard to live in Michigan and not have seen it. This is a split down the side. It was focused so that it was shooting oil down into a wetland. The wetland filled up, back up to about 1.5 feet high and then flowed into the creek and on into the Kalamazoo River. This is what Ceresco Dam looked like on the 29th of July. You can see the brown is oil. These are vacuum trucks that are starting to work on pumping the oil off of the surface. This is from the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board Accident Report. And it shows the exact problem with the pipe. It's actually well-designed pipe. It works very well in most places. However, when it's coated with a film-type coating, that coating tends to gap out around the longitudinal seam well. And if that's in a position where it can gain moisture, the moisture is trapped inside the gap and rusts through. So if we go back to this picture, you'll see that the seam weld is right here and is unaffected, but just below it is the fish mouth where the pipe burst. This had shown defect on several different passages of tooling that looks for defects, but it did not rise to the threshold that Enbridge was using at the time for inspection. There's so many tales about subsequently they pumped thousands of barrels of oil through the pipeline trying to overcome what they thought was a problem that were simply emptied out into the marshland where the pipeline is buried. So that's the explanation for that one. 6B is being replaced. I think everybody knows that, the line. And if you look at the capacities, I'll get this after a while. This is the one to look at. The 36-inch portion that runs up to Stockbridge has a higher capacity than the XL pipeline, the Keystone XL. So it's not a small pipeline, it's not a small project. They're spending a couple of $2 billion to get essentially the same kind of Canadian crude that the Keystone XL would carry coming through Michigan. And we're getting absolutely nothing in return for it, except Petcoke in Detroit. So then the 30-inch line, which goes on into Sarnia, goes up to a very high capacity also. There's some stories about that, but they're for another day. You heard of the Exxon Pegasus pipeline, Mayflower, Arkansas. You'll see this type of gap. This photo was taken by the law firm that's representing people down there. This is from a type of pipe that was welded improperly with just folding it around a mandrel, and then low frequency resistance welding. And that edge, after a few years and a little bit of flexing, comes apart. This low frequency resistance weld is important because this pipeline from Freedom Junction, which is southwest of Ann Arbor, to Detroit, and another part of it to Toledo, that's been in operation for some time, our low frequency is resistance welded pipe. These are part of an older Wolverine pipeline that comes all the way from Indiana, comes over to Freedom Junction, used to take refined product into Detroit, but that's been terminated, and these older pipelines are now sitting there with what will be the heavy crude oil out of line 6B. So in the future, you might see some breaks over there. A lot of these other secondary pipelines in this area also low frequency resistance welded. There's another line that's coming into eastern Michigan from the Marcellus Shale. The Marcellus Shale is one of the biggest gas fields in the United States. Shale gas, it's the big fracking zones where everybody's concentrating their information on fracking. There's another shale zone, the Utica in Ohio, in eastern Ohio. Once that gas comes out, it gets treated and the liquids are taken out. Those gas liquids are now on their way over to Sarnia through Marysville, Michigan, and across the St. Clair River. Most of these lines are old Sunoco Logistics refined product lines, which largely composed of low frequency your electric welded pipe. Now, the interesting thing about natural gas liquids, propanes, butanes, etc., when lines break, they tend to spread over the ground. They don't rise, they don't evaporate. They spread over the ground until they're ignited, and then they act like a bomb and take all of the oxygen out of the air as well as the explosive effect. The U.S. military developed a few tricks with those.
How old are these lines?
These lines?
Mm-hmm.
These date to the 50s and 60s.
I was a pipe fitter for many years, and I never ever welded a pipe that had a seam in it. It was all seamless pipe.
Yeah.
And that was in the late 70s. So I'm curious when these lines were.
And most of these pipelines, you'll find, if you can find the records, which are almost impossible to get to, are composed of sections of seamless and sections of low frequency resistance welded. The 6B line that's going in is spiral welded, resistance welded pipe out of Canada. And everybody used to have a problem with it because the strength wasn't as high, but now they've developed mechanisms to make sure that the spec is as high. There's a lot of stuff going on in pipelines. If you talk about seamless pipe, the two that have gained a recent notoriety, the pipelines under the Straits of Mackinac. They're two 20-inch lines that parallel the bridge, not very far to the west, that are broken down out of a 30-inch line. But those two lines are totally seamless. The only welds in them are the circumferential spool welds. And the problem with them is the supports for the pipe on the bottom are not very good. Some people have done some recent diving on them to check the status. I don't have as much problem with the seamless pipe as I do the approaches on both sides. Both sides of those are the old pipe with the plastic wrap, and if they're within a mile, and it's Michigan, wherever you're within a mile of anything, you're gonna run it into water. And that water's gonna connect to some more water. So to believe that if you're high and dry on land, you're not gonna have an effect on water is ridiculous. Enbridge Marshall oil spill cleanup, this is the old Ceresco Dam from 1910. One of the most interesting things I find in this, and this will interest you, there are no trees. This is probably one of the eras when Michigan had already been cut over once and being cut over again, either for charcoal, for farmland, for whatever. You find the eastern United States has been cut over so many times, and it's very hard to find anything that's very old. Yeah.
I had a question with the XL pipeline and the publicity that gets, 350.org, Bill McKinnon.
Yeah.
We've had our pipelines for many, many years going right through the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
Why isn't that on the national scene?
Because aren't many of us that say anything about it?
And then the spillway near Kalamazoo, largest inland, it wasn't seem like talked about on a national level really that much at all.
No, no. I can tell you why. Look at the Kalamazoo River. And we'll get to it in a minute. It doesn't get talked about much either. This is what it looked like on 14 August last year, just before they started to tear it out. This is the impoundment above Ceresco Dam. It was being dredged by 4 suction dredges. Whoops. One here, one there, one there, one up around the bend. They're cutting a throughway, a new channel in the muck that had collected over time because it's now it's drained, already drained down. That throughway is being left. They'll go back in the spring and they'll scrape back the edges of the channel. The dam, I don't think I have anything that shows taking the dam out. This is what happened to the sediment that was sucked out by the dredges. These are Geo Tubes. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Geo Tubes. They're mesh bags that you pump slurry into. The water drains out, the water's then treated, goes back in the river. This is the treatment plant here. The Geo Tubes are open, slit, and then they load the material up and take it off to a landfill. There's some oil left in it. The landfills like it because it's a nice capping material. And it's not hazardous because it doesn't leak out, it's fully attached to the center. This is the similar setup that has been talked about at Bentler Automotive in Augusta. This is a larger setup than that one will be. Of course, the problem with Bell's Brewery not wanting it close to him, and that's now been resolved, and they will start dredging the Morrow Pond probably within a couple of weeks, as long as they can get out. Price tag on the cleanup for the Marshall spill, according to the financials from Enbridge, is $1 million plus, $1 billion plus. Now imagine what that amount of money could have done if they only would have taken a little bit more care and had a lower threshold than what they were looking for as defects in their pipeline. Pretty incredible. I think all of them should have been fired as malfeasance. Just the shareholders should have revolted.
Seize their assets.
Okay, now we talked about, Michelle talked about legacy pollution. It's all around us. You talk about water courses any place in the United States, you're likely to find PCBs. You're likely to find PCB on 1260. 1260 was in almost every electrical fixture in the United States for years. You can find it in ballasts, in school rooms, in the lighting system. It used to be put in ceramic tile as a plasticizer. Various grades of PCB of differing molecular weights and different chlorine compositions are all over. So you just have to figure, okay, I'm gonna have to live with some of it. Problem is, in the Kalamazoo River, there's a lot of registry, which is a branch of CDC, to do an analysis of the water-borne part of PCB, if there is any, and what is the recreational hazard. And there, we have a paper on file that says it's fully cleared for recreation, even for minor mouthfuls. Kids probably shouldn't be playing in the sandbars and eating the sediment, but otherwise, it's fine. As far as canoeing, as far as anything else, it's okay. The nice thing about getting rid of these dams is they're on some of the highest gradient parts of the river. And from Plainwell down past Allegan could, in fact, in the future, if everything was done right, be a nice whitewater run. It's a great river. Nobody's heard of it. It's just a kind of a dirty river that sits down there in farmland. Well, it has a reputation of being one of the worst rivers in Michigan, but it's not. Yeah.
You say they're gonna start dredging Morrow Pond here this year?
It will be the upstream parts
Right.
for oil.
Oh, is that right? It
Yeah.
doesn't have to do with the PCBs?
No,
Okay.
everybody's deadly afraid of getting any PCB. There's some PCB in Morrow Pond. Nobody knows who they belong to.
Right.
So everybody wants to ignore them.
So how are they gonna get the oil out of the sediment without disturbing the PCBs? Are you familiar?
They're going to try hard.
They're gonna try, okay. Gotcha.
At one time, there seemed to be a threat when the oil spill happened that if the oil got into PCBs, contaminated sediment, that it would release PCBs into the water column. Because somebody had done some laboratory experiments, but they were using quantities and temperatures and things that were unlikely to see in nature.
Gotcha.
So that didn't happen. They've looked below Morrow Pond, Morrow Dam, to see if there's oil residual in the sediments. It's indeterminate. So hopefully the booming that was done right at Morrow Dam, which was extensive, has kept it out of the rest of the river. I mean, there's oil enough from, particularly you get down to Saugatuck and you find all the boats that operate down there, and it leaves a lot of PAHs and sludges and stuff from just, recreational
Sure.
boating, and not real clean. I think I'm gonna run out of time once we get going. Water use. This is what I'm involved with a lot of, and hydroelectric power, if you look at the statistics for the Great Lakes, what you find is that most of what they call a use, they used to call it withdrawal, but hydroelectric power doesn't really withdraw water. But 96% of the use of water through the basin is for hydroelectric purposes. Now, you can understand that if you look at Niagara. Huge power generating capability. There's some in Michigan, but Michigan tends not to report it. I think that's because consumers doesn't want anybody to know. Some other states, and Ontario, Wisconsin, not Wisconsin, but Minnesota has some from a lake system in, I think it's in Canada, that empties down through Minnesota. They generate power. That also adds to the lake. It's not lake waters within the understanding. The rest of it's only 4%. All the rest of the use is in water. There's a lot of things being said about the water energy nexus these days, and a lot of people are now getting water energy food nexus. And this is interesting because, we're looking at water use for mining fuels. That's coal, but we could put fracking over here. We don't. It's interesting too. We don't see any solar panels or wind turbines on this, and we should. Water supply, using a lot of energy, pumping water to cities. One of the reasons that the Detroit system is being bypassed by the counties to the north and west of it is because it's, the energy to pump all that water through the system is becoming exorbitant. So they're gonna tap Huron themselves and take the water directly west. There are not that many large-scale, there are 3 or 4 large-scale water systems in the state of Michigan that actually use Great Lakes water. The rest of it primarily runs off of groundwater or local streams. But Detroit, Grand Rapids, I don't know what Saginaw does, and now areas north of Detroit will be using treated lake water. Wastewater treatment, of course, returning the water. And one thing about public water systems is they don't consume a lot of water except as evaporation on landscape uses.
Are they returning that water back to the Great Lakes, or are they putting it back into the ground?
No, it goes back into the Great Lakes. Almost all sewer systems discharge to surface water. You know,
No.
Kalamazoo does. Detroit does.
Like in Grand Rapids and.
Yeah, they use the Grand River. And occasionally they have one of those euphemisms, combined sewer overflow. It's because when they built sewers, they said, oh, just, use the same pipe. And when the big storm comes through, it overwhelms the whole system. And for 3 or 4 days in South Haven, Grand Haven, you don't want to get close to the water.
I thought that they separated a lot of that. They're doing a huge project.
They're trying.
Separate.
Some people tell me that Grand Rapids is better than it used to be, but they still have excursions during the summer. Well, then they'll give a warning, unfortunately. But think of it. Think of all of the pipes, the size of the pipes, the number of people, and think about who's going to pay for it. And there isn't enough money in the public coffers to even approach doing things in infrastructure. Here are the biggest water users in the basin. Ontario, Michigan comes in pretty heavily because we're surrounded by the lakes. This is very important. Inflows plus runoff. Inflows equal runoff and precipitation. Precipitation directly into the lake surface. Down here at the bottom is the cumulative hydrological effects on flows, consumptive uses plus diversions, the water that flows out of the lakes. And what it shows is we're getting a lot more water into the lakes than we're taking out of the lakes. So the lakes are net benefiters of diversion. And a lot of that is downstream from what we think of the Great Lakes. It's in the St. Lawrence Basin. But if you look at the whole system, there's a net benefit. If you take this same mapping for Lake Michigan and Huron, it's negative. We're losing more. Here's where I get into Southwest Michigan Water Resources Council and the WAT. Is everybody familiar with this system? I really do recommend that you go home, get on the internet, and look at miwwat.org. And you'll see what water withdrawal, the philosophy and the mechanism for control of water withdrawals in the state of Michigan is doing. Everyone that is a large quantity, 70 gallons per minute, that's extracting water from the waters of the state, and all water is included in that.
That include fracking types of?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
We'll get to fracking as a special case. Anybody that wants to withdraw a lot of water has to go through this assessment tool. You go in, you pick a place, you tell them how deep it is, how big it is, how much you're going to operate, your pumping schedule, and it comes back and it says, okay. And that's an A, and there's no further action. You register, you send in the information after you've drilled the well, you're registered, you're online, you're fine. Comes back B, it's, okay, but let's talk about it. Comes back C, it's, come and see us, and comes back D, forget it. So you can then move the well around, this is all on the computer, move the well around, move the pumping schedule, do things, and it may say yes or it may say no. And then you get on the telephone and you talk to DEQ. You may send them lots of details about, hey, I've got all this data that you may not have that shows there's more water than your modeling system shows there is. Okay, so then DEQ has mechanisms and people that can look at it, can research it. One of the big things is a stream. If a stream is going through the watershed, and some of these watersheds are very, very small, if it's on the mapping as a stream, and it turns out there really isn't a stream there, they simply take it out of the model, and you don't have to worry anymore, because the whole thing is based on an index stream flow. For the driest months of the year, what is the average index flow? Because this system is one of the few in the world that is protective of wildlife. It's called an adverse resource impact if you reduce the index flow to the point where the characteristic fish population will suffer.
Did Ice Mountain fill one of these out?
I think that happened before this came in.
Characteristic fish population to when?
That's been decided and it's on file. DNR figured it out, I think, up through the 90s. I don't know the terminus date of, when it was done. Now, I suggested that back in 2012, when we had a drought, would have been a great time for everybody to go out and survey all of these streams, and then the next year when the water came back, figure out what happened. Did we have fish population in 2012? Did we have fish population in 2013? But we don't know. Again, nobody has the money to do this. We're simply lacking in, part of it's political will to get it done, to insist on it getting done so that we know what we really have and what we don't have. So you get interesting fights with a lot of people about, what does this all mean? And I have heard people stand up and say, it's inaccurate, it should be done away with. We have lots of water and we should be allowed to pump it up anytime we want to. And there are a lot of those folks. So really, if you're interested in water, this is one of the main things that you should understand, what's going on in Michigan. Here was the mission statement: provide refined analysis of the water resources of St. Joe, Kalamazoo River watersheds, review the application of the screening tool. That's what they really wanted. This was mostly from farm interests, and assessment process at the regional scale. And then they said, okay, let's take some technology and look around at things. Most of it I agree with, but what they, if you read the subtext is, they wanted to trash the system and managed to hold them back. Here's an interesting thing. This is the kind of stuff you get into. Here are all of the measuring systems that have been deployed in the two watersheds. Let me see if I can find, and DNR and DEQ have been adding. Some private interests have also added their own flow measurements and temperature gauges, because they develop their own models as a counterbalance to the watt. They are presenting in Lansing to the State Council on Tuesday. They're presenting the results of their model, and I think they're going to make a formal appeal that their model be used in preference to the state model. Yeah.
Isn't that a huge conflict of interest?
What?
These companies, they want to use the water, so of course they're going to say there's more there than you think.
Well, I've said that, for any paper to be academically realized, it has to be peer reviewed and published. Yeah. And I've said, come back when you have it peer reviewed, and everybody can look at who your peer reviewers are. and you publish it and get the results of feedback on it, and then it should be acceptable to the state to modify things. Other than that, it's simply data. You can bring it forward, and DEQ will recognize acceptable data at any time. I'll show you what they've done with it. These are the areas for groundwater monitoring. You'll notice these over here are very interesting because they're headwaters for the smaller rivers that run into the St. Joe. And they're flashier. They're gravel hills, they're the moraines, and the water doesn't stay there. It comes out, but they want to drill wells as if they can tap water there all the time. It's not there. One of the work groups from this council looked at how the site-specific review, if you have a specific site and you have problems with dealing with DEQ about it, this is what you have to go through. They wanted to track it out and map it out. And it is cumbersome, but it has the guarantee that you have to prove, you know, the burden of proof is on the beneficial user. And I don't see any problem with that. If you want the water, you should be able to pay for the science. It's gonna be your benefit. Pay for the science to prove that DEQ's wrong. Or to improve DEQ's general knowledge of what's going on. So here's, in 2 years, there were 710 registrations. 370 were in Kalamazoo and St. Joe. The emphasis in St. Joe watershed is seed corn. And the amount of money that is developed in seed corn growing is enormous. And there are several companies, national companies, that are very, very interested in making sure that resource is there. One of the things you do if you want to grow seed corn under contract is you have to have irrigation systems. So there aren't many landowners in that area that are not developing irrigation systems. So the number of pivots you see through there, they're all bright and shiny because they've been put in the last 2 or 3 years. There have been Zone D denials. There have only been 5 in the whole state. And I can't give you the details, but none of them were within the farming areas. So yeah, it's expected that there'll be more because there are more users, and it's a confined area. And until we understand it better, the modeling is simply going to say it only has a certain amount of water. You simply can't extract it. I asked the consultant that's going to present on Tuesday. He said, "Well, it seems like there's a lot more water there." And I said, "Okay, did it come from upstream dams?" I don't know. I said, "Well, where did it come from?" Because conservation matter says you can't generate water out of thin air. It just isn't there. It's got to come from someplace. And until you can explain that, I don't understand what you're talking about.
About 2 more minutes.
Fracking withdrawals. Here we go. This is the Ensemble and Manistee River watersheds in the upper reaches. The green are sites where an MSU group put in flow measuring equipment. The triangles are fracking well pads. Okay, this has been operating a couple of years, and they have found that there's less water there than the WAT said there would be by an awful lot. 17.9 times less, 15.4. That says, whoops. Remember, the WAT is a screening tool, and it uses data that are averaged across the state. And that's the problem. These are upper reaches of streams that are in, you know, that are probably like the same gravels down in the southern Michigan area where the water goes through very quickly and doesn't stay there. It doesn't get stored in the geology. So what's happened? They have changed the index flows on the basis of this information, and you can see that in these areas, they have decreased the index flow. they're saying the water is not there. Down here, where the farmers have come forward with a lot of good information, they've increased the index flow. So you can see that depending on the specific site, and that's the important thing. Water is not continuous in a sheet. We got strong is, let's look at public supply. And you go, wait a minute, you know, we have 4% of uses other than hydroelectric, and if you look at the breakdown of that 4%, public supply is maybe 30%, something like that, and you see, that's not very big. And most of those people know what they're doing. They don't want leaky systems. They don't want to treat water and throw it away. They want somebody to buy it, pay for it. And yet you find that those systems don't audit their books very often sometimes, and so, you know, it depends on how good a manager they are about following up on things. But everybody points to them of let's get lower consumption appliances and let's really make them come to heel. Why? What good does it do it? Let's look at large volume and consumption. You know, if you want to look at something, agriculture supposedly consumes 70% of all the water it puts on. But how else do you grow things? Evapotranspiration says that's the way things grow. But if you see somebody wasting water by spraying the county road for half an hour before it cycles back over, that's waste. And it's right in the code that the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development Code says if you're a good farmer, you don't do that. And they're supposed to be rewarded by following their own guidelines. They're supposed to measure the application water, they're not supposed to spray the roads, they're supposed to know exactly how much they need and not put on too much because it just drains through. But who knows how many people do it. It's like anything else, they're good applicators and they're bad ones, right? And some of them just don't care.
Okay, we need to stop here so that